My name is Doug Gallagher. I am with AWS in a group called Cloud Economics. So me and my teammates, we work with customers to help them uncover the value of moving from on-prem to AWS. So what does that mean? That means looking at single applications, multiple applications, even entire data centers, or more and more all-in. So uncovering the value from multiple pillars, which I'll cover today, ultimately to help strengthen the business case for customers. I'm going to try to make this session interactive, so if you have questions, you want to just raise your hand. One of my colleagues, Hadley's in the back, and she'll walk around with a microphone. So you want to raise your hand, she'll walk up to you, and then you can speak in the microphone. As far as housekeeping agenda, I'm going to cover the business value framework. I would say that there's really two things I'd like you to take away from this session. One is, what are the components of a business case? But then I would say more importantly, what are the items aside from just cost that really help bring value to your stakeholders? Because we've done this hundreds of times with many customers, and we've seen oftentimes that cost is just one small factor, but these other benefits really help bring value to the business. I'll also cover, as I'm talking, some customer examples and talk about some best practices based upon these hundreds of engagements that our team has worked through. So this is what we call a Cloud Value Framework, and it consists of 4 pillars. And this was developed working with many customers, and it's also been validated with third-party analysts. And I'm going to start on the left-hand side and talk about cost. But then I really want to quickly get away from cost and talk about the other values. So cost, that has to do with comparing your whatever's in scope on-prem, whether that's the application or multiple data centers or even all into AWS. So looking at the hardware, looking at the storage, looking at servers, networking, et cetera, gathering all those costs. And I'll go through an example in a couple of minutes, and then doing a comparison on AWS to look at what the delta is. And we have some really great customer examples. For example, GE Oil and Gas. They've moved about 500 applications to AWS, and they've seen a cost reduction of about 52%. But as we move to the right here, I really want to focus on some of these other pillars. And the first one is staff productivity. And staff productivity doesn't necessarily mean headcount changes, but it means that working with customers, we've seen that there are certain task hours that have been significantly reduced, and those hours can be repurposed elsewhere. And customers can look at that in 2 ways. One, they can quantify it in dollars, or they can look at it as far as hours saved. A great example is Sage. They are a consulting company in Germany, and they've estimated they've saved about 5,000 hours annually by moving to AWS. Our third pillar is operational resilience. So this has to do with operational downtime. A survey from Nucleus Research estimated they analyzed 198 customers that moved workloads from from on-prem to AWS, and they saw on average a 32% uptime improvement, which can be pretty significant. And I'll go through some examples later on how we can actually help quantify those benefits. A great example there is Expedia. They're in the process of moving about 80% of the critical workloads to AWS. And when they were analyzing whether or not to move to AWS, they were looking at their EMEA and Asia website traffic, and they noticed that there was a latency, and that was leading to customers abandoning their website. By moving to AWS, they were able to improve that latency. And the last pillar, which I think is probably the most exciting, and whenever I talk to CIOs and folks with senior folks within an organization, like, okay, yeah, costs, okay, fine, but business agility, that's really fun. This is the exciting things. If we can move to AWS, we can be more agile. We can develop applications faster. We can deploy to new markets faster. So this has to do with looking at those KPIs and quantifying those benefits and including them in our business case. So here is a sample output. And a business case output can be many shapes and sizes. It can be graphical. It can be numeric. It depends on the customer. And one thing I'll probably reiterate a couple times, it's very important to understand what the timelines are within your organization. Are you faced with a refresh? Is there a colo lease expiring? And you kind of want to work backwards from there. So you want to start as early as possible. In this example, we have all 4 pillars broken out. First is the cost savings. Sometimes that's done at the server, hardware, networking roll-up, and sometimes it's done at a higher level roll-up, such as a business unit or at an application level. And the next is staff productivity. That we'll model that as either a cost savings as far as hours or dollars. The next is operational resilience. That is almost always done at the application level or a grouping of applications. And the last is business agility. And I'm going to go through this later in more detail, but we have a whole host of KPIs that we've gathered from other customers that we've worked with. And these KPIs, they've included in their business case, and they've actually been able to achieve those savings. Net Promoter Score. All right, so I want to start with cost savings. And I want to talk about an example. So before I joined AWS, I was an IT finance director for a large bank. And right around now, in the summer, we would start our budgeting process. We'd probably go through about 62 iterations, and that would continue through about Q1 of the next year. We work with the business to gather the demand. And me and my team, we'd model out the infrastructure cost, and then we move that over to the infrastructure team who would actually provision the resources. And they would say, OK, well, here's your predicted demand, so we need to build in a buffer. We need to make sure we have enough capacity to meet peak demand. But then what would happen is we would get the actual demand, and it would never meet what we actually provisioned. So what does that mean? Well, we have an opportunity cost. We have resources that are sitting idle and that we already paid for. From some analysis our team has done, we see that customers typically, their utilization's right around the 40% range. On the other side, there's a lost opportunity. So what happens if demand excels what we provisioned for? Well, then we can get into missed customer transactions, even brand damage because customers cannot access a website, for example. And we look at AWS. AWS customers can actually provision for what they need, that they can scale up or down based upon demand. So what's included in doing a cost comparison? It's very important when doing this modeling, when you're looking at your on-prem cost, to take into account all direct and indirect cost. So direct costs will include hardware, your maintenance, your storage, and your associated maintenance. But you also need to take into account other costs, which in certain organizations may sit in essential P&L, for example, power, space, and cooling. And the reason why that's important is because AWS, all these items are baked into the pricing. And typically, when we help customers think about the on-prem costs, we'll match their refresh cycle. And typically, customers will refresh their hardware over 3 to 5 years. So we'll try to match that window in the analysis. So let's look at a simple cost savings example. So let's assume we have one bare metal server that's 16 cores, 16 gig of RAM, and it's peaking 50% of the time. In this case, we're going to map that to an Amazon EC2 instance of a C4 4x large. What I would recommend to customers, and when we're helping to build a business case, we'll bring in some of the AWS technical solutions architects, and they'll actually get very familiar with the architecture of a customer, and they'll help align to the appropriate instances. So on the on-prem side of the equation, we have our server hardware. We have our maintenance on top, typically 10 to 15% a year. We have our rack infrastructure cost. We have our facilities, so that's the power, space, cooling, whether you're in an on-prem owned data center or a co-location. And we have our labor. And I'll go into labor when I go into the separate activity in some more details. You also have software. Now, in this simple example, I'm going to assume it's a Linux box, and it's not virtualized, so there's no OS licenses or hypervisor licenses. And we have a total, $28,000 over 3 years. Now, on the AWS side, we have our instance pricing, which is all published on our website. Let's assume there's still labor on the customer side, a slight reduction in labor. We have our AWS support. And there's our 3-year comparison. Simple example, but the point is on the on-prem side, we need to make sure that we think about and gather all these types of costs. And what we like to tell customers where it's difficult to gather certain costs, to use industry assumptions. Some great customer examples. For example, News Corp, a mass media company, they publicly stated they saved $100 million by moving to AWS. Condé Nast, another mass media company, they've reduced their cost by about 40%. All right, so now I've talked about cost, and I want to move on to staff productivity. And staff productivity all has to do with moving from non-strategic work to more strategic activities. And on AWS, is anyone familiar with the term lift and shift? Some nods, OK. So we see about 40% of the workloads that move to AWS are in a lift and shift mode. And essentially, that's you're not going to really do much refactoring. We might right-size the right kind of instance, but you're not really going to do much work. You're kind of just getting up in the cloud. But as customers mature on AWS, they're able to take advantage of higher-level services, such as, which was mentioned this morning, serverless, machine learning, et cetera. So we see the strategic activities they're able to increase as customers mature on AWS. Conversely, tactical activities are able to significantly decrease. So let's look at an example. So from our experience, there's two ways to think about and model staff productivity. One is a detailed task-by-task analysis by role type, which I'm going to go through in a second. The second is a level up, where we'll look at server specifications, storage specifications, and come up with ratios to say, OK, in an on-prem environment, we need X amount of server administrators to provision a certain amount of servers and storage. And then as we move to AWS, that ratio gets better. That's a little bit, there's going to be a little bit more of a variance there, but it's a lot quicker. And for many customers, that's good enough. But for other customers, we want to do more of a detailed analysis, which is perfectly fine. So let's look at the server purchasing process. That significantly gets reduced. The time spent on a server refresh can be very, very consuming. I was on a call with the CIO of a big insurance company a couple weeks ago, and he said, Doug, we have teams of people, and they spend about 80% of their time on server refresh. And that was not just server administrators, but that was PMOs and other host of resources. Next one I want to point out is repairing hardware. That completely goes away on AWS. So how do we quantify this? Let's take a look at this example of a server administrator. Let's assume this one administrator spends 25% of their time on the task on the left. And let's assume on AWS, we're going to see a reduction of about 75% in hours. So if we do the simple math, there's about a 19% efficiency gain. Now we can either convert that to hours or dollars. In that example, we did, yep. So you can either include it. Some customers want to include it within their cost comparison because they look at headcount as a cost. And other customers say, no, I don't want to talk about headcount. Let's look at hours. That's perfectly fine. It will strengthen the business case. Again, some great examples. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention, our website has a host of really, really great customer case studies. Customers from all types of industries, all types of sizes. It talks about the company, the challenges they were facing, and how AWS helped solve those problems. A good example here is New Log Consulting. They were able to reduce their administrative overhead by 50% by taking advantage of our storage solutions. OK, so I want to now go into the third pillar, which is operational resilience. And operational resilience has to do with a cost of downtime. So these figures on the screen have been gathered from third-party studies. The annual Fortune 1000 experiences about $1.25 to $2.5 billion a year on a downtime event. The cost per hour of a critical application downtime up to $1 million. I know my experience working for a large bank, it was a lot more. If one of our trading systems went down, it could be multi-million dollars. Average cost of a data center breach, $3.6 million. Cost per lost record, $141. And the average cost per hour of downtime, about $500,000. So what makes up some of these staggering costs of downtime? So Ponemon Research analyzed and aggregated all this data, and they came up with about 6 or 7 buckets of what makes up these costs. One being end user productivity. So when an application goes down, the customer or the person interfacing with the application is non-productive. Second one, and the largest, about 35%, is business disruption. I remember a couple years back, there was a market-making company, and there was a downtime event, and it actually ended up bankrupting the firm. So it was pretty significant. Yep.
So is that considering the impact of productivity for not just the total users, but perhaps either seasonality or a particular period of time where perhaps it's a peak period of time where most users are getting impacted, and therefore you have a larger cost or cost savings or cost impact?
From what I understand, it's normalized over an annual basis, so I'm not sure if it takes into account the seasonality. But if you want to speak to me afterwards, I can point you to the study.
I'm not sure how you quantify it, but isn't there a cost of damage to the brand?
Yep.
That has to get factored as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So let's look at a simple example of how to quantify an improvement in an application uptime from looking at on-prem to AWS, and let's look at a conservative approach here. So we're going to look at 2 different cost buckets. We're going to look at business user productivity, and then we're going to group everything else into one category for simplicity. So let's assume this application has 1,500 users. And let's assume the average annual cost of an FTE is $125,000. So if we do that math, it comes out to about $1,500 per minute per year. I can show anyone the math after the conversation if anyone's interested. So if we look at the other categories, let's assume the other categories on the prior slide, let's assume it's about half the cost, so about $750 per minute. And I'm going to take a conservative approach here, and let's just say that the application moving from on-prem to AWS is about a 0.1% improvement. So I'm going to multiply that. So by the way, that 0.1% improvement comes out to about, on an annual basis, 526 minutes. So if I multiply that by the 1,500 plus the 750, about a 1.2 million annual improvement. So let's look at some customer examples. I really love these customer examples for operational resilience. So Macmillan Education, their India entity, a couple years back, they were looking to do an upgrade of SAP, their implementation. And when they were doing this analysis, they found out that their hardware was very dated. And ultimately, their runtime was about, their availability of the application was about 90%. So a downtime event meant that students for the upcoming school year would not be able to receive their textbooks on time. By moving to AWS, they were able to increase their uptime to close to 100%. Yep, they're all on our website. So if you go to, and I'll actually share with you the link at my last slide. I have the link, yep. They're really great reads. I encourage everyone to take time to go through them. Yep. So now I want to move on to the 4th pillar. And again, this is one of the most exciting and energizing pillars. And when we talk to customers, this is really where they want to focus. So they understand the cost element. Okay, we want to make sure it's compelling enough cost-wise, but let's talk about some fun KPIs and what we can actually do for our business. And what's actually great about these KPIs, they can add to the bottom line and ultimately drive new business and revenue and ultimately profit to the customer. So one KPI is time to market. So with AWS, customers can develop much faster. That means they can launch applications faster and ultimately launch those applications out into the market much faster. And by the way, these KPIs, we've gathered these from working with various customers, and customers have actually included these KPIs in their business cases, as well as realized these values. Another one that's not as obvious, but I wanted to point it out here, is employee retention. And employees, they get more excited, especially developers that get more excited, and their morale increases when they're actually in a cloud environment where they can develop faster and experiment faster. So not as obvious, but we should be thinking about all these types of KPIs. So let's look at an example. Let's assume we have an application from a subscriber-based company that's customer-facing. And let's assume that we were able to launch this application to the market about 5 months faster compared to on-prem, so from 6 months to 1 month. And let's assume that customers interfacing with this application in the traditional on-prem environment, the conversion rate was about 80%. And let's assume we were able to improve that to 90%. And the reason why we were able to improve it because we had a latency reduction. Let's assume, very simple here, our marketing department can help us gather this actual figure, but let's just assume the customer lifetime value is $1,000. And let's assume that this application receives about 10,000 clicks per month. Let's do some multiplication again. So 10,000 clicks a month times a 10% conversion rate uplift times the lifetime value times the improvement in months that we're able to launch the application faster. So we get a $5 million time to market benefit. Yep. So in this example, the customer was able to develop the application faster, so they were actually able to launch it faster. The application. So they're able to provision the infrastructure faster, able to implement it, and ultimately able to roll it out faster. Again, some case studies. One I really like is Kellogg's. Their revenues are about $15 billion a year. And within this industry, Kellogg spends about a third of their revenue on promotional trade activities such as coupons. And in the on-prem solution, they can only run one simulation to annualize the spend per day. With AWS, they can run dozens. Questions? Sorry, question?
I really like the business
Yep.
agility KPI
Yep.
that you showed. I was wondering if you have any benchmark values for those KPIs that we can use
Yep.
for the business case.
Yep. Actually, I can provide you with a list of those KPIs as well as the source for each of them.
And not just the KPIs, their benchmark values. For example, time to market reduces
Yep.
from 6 months
Yep.
to 1 month.
Mhm.
Employee absenteeism reduces from whatever
Yep.
percentage to a new percent, so that we can quantify that into dollar terms.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay.
I think I met you. Were you at our boot camp yesterday?
Not yesterday, but I have attended a boot camp.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it. So I want to talk about business case best practices, and I want to start with the levels of business cases. So in the very beginning, I mentioned that it's important to start as early as possible and to know what timelines exist within an organization. So again, are we up against a refresh in a couple months? Is there a colo expiration? Then within the organization, what types of approvals are necessary? Does it need to go through multiple layers of approvals? And then lastly, how close do we need to get? Is directional okay, or do we need to be more detailed and more refined? So these are the types of questions we should be thinking about as early as possible and asking within our organization. From our experience, these come into, I would say, two flavors. One is directional, where a customer says, OK, close enough is good enough. And in those examples, those business cases can be completed very, very quickly, and sometimes in days. So it's simple level of inputs, using certain industry assumptions, a couple of different presentations, and then it moves up within the organization. I would say most customers do require more of a detailed business case, and this is going to take a little bit longer because we need to be more refined. So there's going to be more iterations. We need to get more granular in our data. But again, what's important is just to know this as soon as possible so we can plan accordingly. So what's a typical process to build a business case? So when our team engages with a customer, we typically follow this methodology. But even if our team is not involved, you all can use similar practices. So we usually start with a kickoff. So we understand what's in scope, who are the executive sponsors, what are the timelines? Again, is there a refresh? Is there a colo expiration? Is there something else we're up against? Is there a business imperative? Is there a budget coming up? And then the next is data collection. Now, from our experience, data collection, depending on resources available within the customer to actually gather everything together, it can take 1 to 2 weeks. Sometimes it can take longer. And I could talk to anyone about this afterwards, but there's actually some partners we work with that will actually do the heavy lifting for you all. So if you're interested in gathering data, but you don't have the bandwidth to do so, there are partners that can plug in and actually gather the data. So they can gather server specifications, such as CPU and RAM, server utilization patterns, et cetera. And once the data is collected, then we go through the Q&A process. OK, let's take a look at assumptions. Do we have the right data? Do we know what units everything's in? Are we in megabytes or gigabytes, et cetera? Let's refine that. Let's comb through it. Let's scrub it. And then afterwards, we start iterating. We come up with one number or one analysis, and we iterate over and over till everyone's comfortable. Ultimately, we want to make sure that those within the customer own the business case and that they can speak to the business case. So when our team is engaged, there's two flavors. One is we'll help the customer put together the business case, and we'll work with a couple individuals within the organization. And then at some point say, OK, the customer say, OK, Doug, we're good. We got this from here. There's other flavors where our team will actually help present the business case to senior executives within an organization, such as a CFO. I talked about most of these, but I want to go over them again. Business case best practices present the overall value of AWS, so not just the cost savings. Really look at those KPIs, look at staff productivity. And again, staff productivity, it's fine. We can use hours. Look at your applications. Look at your existing uptime. There's partners out there that can actually plug in to look at and measure what the existing uptime of an application is. You want to build the business case collaboratively with stakeholders. So it shouldn't just be in a silo of just IT. That's not a good idea. When I was in IT finance and I found out the IT group was putting together a business case and pulling together numbers I didn't recognize, I would put the brakes on everything, and I would raise a storm. So as soon as possible, involve finance. And because finance owns the general ledger, so they need to be able to speak to the numbers. Again, start the business case as soon as possible. And research to get you started. So we actually have a light version of a TCO calculator on our website, which you can play around with. It'll actually help you think about those cost items I talked about earlier. And this is the link to our website that has all these great case studies. By the way, these slides will be available after the summit. But I encourage you to take a look at these case studies. Does anyone have questions? No questions? We have a question over here. Thank you. Oh, we'll get you up over there. Thanks.
How do you see the, like, how many business cases do you do in a year, and then how is the response like? What is your feeling about the business community wanting to do a business case because before engaging in the move from on-premise to AWS?
So the question is, how often do customers want to put together a business case before making a decision? I would say most customers do, because they want to see what the value is. So it's like any other kind of investment. So say if you're in a manufacturing company, you want to buy this machine, right? You want to look at what the value is. I would say most customers do. And again, the earlier we do it, the better. Our team has done over the last couple of years hundreds of business cases. So our team has a lot of experience, and I would tell you that our team kind of has a good sense of what it takes to run a data center on-prem versus AWS. And we've also helped customers quantify the other value benefits.
And you do primarily for Amazon. You don't do any other business cases?
We're AWS.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
You answered part of the question, which is about how many business cases have you guys used to refine data. Do you offer tools to then start measuring the actual business case achievement?
Yep. So so the question was, post business case, how do we actually measure? So there's two flavors. One, there's actually part of our extended team within cloud economics called cost optimization. They'll actually help customers review their spend. So Amazon's actually the only company I've ever worked for that doesn't want a customer to spend more money than they should. So they'll help analyze your instance selections, your purchases and options. There's also partner tools available as well that can help monitor and measure your spend. And if you're interested in some of those partners, I can talk to you about those afterwards. So our team we do not, no. So if you're interested in engaging our team, I don't know if you do have an account manager. If not, you can speak to me afterwards, and I can put you in touch. Yep. Question?
So we have a large number of business units that went off on their own, got their own accounts, set them up. We're now trying to centralize the support. Do you have any business cases around, improvements in support?
We do. Yep. So that has to do with the cost optimization practice. So it says, okay, it was compelling to move to AWS, but now we need to actually get some controls in-house, right? So we need to set up that center of excellence, we call, or the center, to actually make sure we control everything. So yes, we do. And I can talk to you about that afterwards if you're interested. Hey.
How has your framework had to change to support some of the new services that you're offering, like Kubernetes or machine learning? And
Yep.
what are you finding in terms of the ROI? Because I assume kind of the weight is being moved towards the knowledge part of it.
Yep. So the question is, how do we model out some of our other higher level services aside from just infrastructure as a service? So we actually have some proprietary models that we've built to look into that. For example, Amazon RDS or Hadoop as a service in Amazon EMR. So we actually have done some of those select cases. I would say the majority is still more on the infrastructure as a service, but I think we're starting to see more and more customers like, okay, we kind of get that infrastructure. We kind of get, the graph I showed in the beginning, we kind of get the whole provisioning example. Now let's look at other higher level services. So we have done some of those. In some of those cases, we actually see a very compelling benefit. For example, EMR, because there's different licensing changes on-prem versus AWS. So.
Tied to that, since you're encouraging a lot of serverless architectures, and obviously getting rid of that infrastructure is going to be pretty key. Have you started building some models for that?
We have. We're in the beginning stages, but we have, yes. And more customers are asking for that analysis. It's a little bit challenging because there's really no on-prem equivalent of serverless, so we kind of have to make assumptions. Okay, here's the code, right? And then how do we kind of fit that to infrastructure? Yeah. Right there.
Application rationalization is certainly a critical part of the migration.
Yep.
How do you talk to people about that? Do you want that to happen a priori, or sort of lift and shift and move? Or what do you see happening, and how does that play in?
Yep.
And do you have any tools to accelerate it?
Okay, great. So two-part question, and let me make sure I got this right. One was, how do we look at application rationalization, lift and shift versus re-architecting? So we actually have our professional services organization or our partners that can help evaluate the application stack. From what we see in our experience, about 40%, I think I mentioned this earlier, 40% is usually a lift and shift. Now, again, mileage may vary based on the customer. But professional services or partners, they'll kind of go in, do a deep dive of the full application stack and determine what is cloud ready, what can move as is, what can actually, frankly, retire. We actually see, especially larger organizations, there's apps, let's just let them die out. Maybe there's like a small dependency, but no one's using the system, so just shut it down. There are tools, so partners actually have tools, and professional services, our professional services organization as well has some tools to help do that analysis. I think right there.
Do you do the studies only on-prem versus cloud, or do you also compare with other cloud providers?
Mostly on-prem.
Hi. Do you guys have samples of case studies or templates that we can use?
Yep, we do. You can speak to me afterwards, and I can put you in touch with one of our account managers, but we actually have many samples and many sample outputs.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Tim Foley. I'm with a company called ThinkStack. We're a partner. From a communication standpoint and gaining buy-in, it's interesting that you're talking about bringing finance in at an early stage. Are you seeing, in the middle market particularly, are you seeing that when project leads are going to finance, are they really just looking at the bottom line financial benefits of all the different metrics that you showed, or are they starting to see the broader, like thinking about the impact that a breach might have on marketing and the brand? And so do you think there's that level of kind of conversation and leadership and sophistication around the broader business case for cloud, or do you think it's, so if we're talking to somebody and we're trying to help them empower themselves to move a project forward, should they just be looking at it purely from a financial standpoint, or make the broader case?
I think it should be much broader, and we're seeing that we're starting to, from our experience, more and more educate traditional finance folks on the value of the cloud. And one customer I worked with, actually, is very interesting. The gentleman we worked with over a couple of months to help build the business case, he was actually promoted to the VP of cloud finance. So I think it's starting to happen more and more and a lot faster, that more and more groups, aside from just traditional IT, are understanding the value of AWS. Thank you, Hadley, for running around the room.
What about security? Cost of security, rather. Isn't that, from a business case perspective, should stand out as its own line item in a vertical itself? Because that's the focus area for everybody in the world right now.
So the question is what about cost of security? Should we include that in the business case? The answer is absolutely. Typically, that falls within the operational resilience bucket. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you.
Hi.
Could you recommend some research resources resources for folks moving from on-prem environments going to startup environments?
On-prem to.
So say you're traditional finance. I mean, I worked for a bank
Okay.
all my life.
Yep.
Looking at the startup world and thinking about AWS, but
Okay.
not really having the right background for it.
Yep.
But
Yeah. Well, let's. We want to talk afterwards.
okay.
Yep. Let's talk afterwards.
All right.
Sure.
Thanks.
Any other questions? So lastly, just within your app, please submit session feedback. This is a good way for us to make sure we improve our content. So please take the time to provide candid feedback. Otherwise, thanks again for taking the time to attend this session. I really appreciate it.